Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yeah, the women pretty much ran the table this week, or at least they fully would have unless a certain trap artist hadn't dropped his project from out of nowhere. But amid some widespread societal panic, let's go back, let's escape for a second, talk about some music, and get back on the pulse. So we have 8 albums on the docket this week, so let's start off with, from Worriers, You or Someone You Know. We're starting this off on Bandcamp again with a slice of punk-adjacent indie rock from Brooklyn, and yes, if you think you have an idea of what this sounds like, you're probably right, but I found myself surprised by how much Lauren Dinizio's throaty vocals support some solid, sizzling tunes with good lead work and a fair number of hooks off the occasional splash of the keys, even if I'm left with a frustrated feeling that they could really use a good producer to give the drums a little more punch and the guitars a little bit more of an edge outside of the admittedly solid solos. As it is, there's a muddiness that creeps into the mix to more than a few songs here, which does a service to Dinizio's striking tone and pretty sharp writing on what might seem to be a breakup album, but has a fair bit more going on when it comes to general feelings of existential dread, loneliness, anxiety, and maybe even asking the question if buying into normalcy is really the punk rock choice. I mean, it's not, and the arc to finding her voice to speak out and find closure, it's a great arc for the back half of the album, but I appreciate the nuance in asking some of those very messy and rather prescient questions. Now, as it is, look, it's not the sort of indie rock that's going to reinvent the wheel, but the hooks are considerably above average and the writing is really solid, especially on songs like End of the World, Chicago Style Pizza is Terrible, and Enough. So if you're curious, this is worth hearing. 7 out of 10, good stuff. Next up, from Carolyn Rose, Superstar. Believe it or not, I try to keep an open mind when artists, especially those who don't really have a clear genre preference or style, when they'll switch things up from project to project. The problem is when these changes reflect shifts in stylism that don't often complement the skills of the artist, which takes us to Carolyn Rose's third album, given that she started more of a retro rock country sound in her debut, and it now seems like she's in this old vaporwave, old Hollywood noir singer-songwriter lane that doesn't seem to really flatter her literate, intensely self-aware brand of satire. It doesn't really mirror her usual subtlety or fully nail the excess that she wants, and that's kind of the big reason why this album doesn't quite click as strongly for me, even if I can't see the running musical metaphor of shallow aspirations to grandeur that slide towards delusion. Now, this is also mirrored in the narrative of the album, a loose, broadly sketched story about a pop songstress chasing her dreams, sacrificing relationships, and flying very close to the sun before the pipe dream crashes down and she winds up back at home and even back in a similar relationship. And this album is at its best when it dials into the deeply rooted insecurities surrounding this mercurial artistic genius and highlighting the detail in some of her vices. The kinky freak like me is the album highlight for a very good reason. And you know what, I really like the thematic point that's hammered home at the end of how said delusions of grandeur and chasing love are framed very differently in society and treated with different weight coming from either men or women. Now, that being said, in going broad, Carolyn Rose sacrificed some of the sharper detail and satirical flair that made her previous album so strong for me. And without many standouts, this does wind up a little bit washed out, undercooked, and featuring a few too many overmixed, muddy synth choices that don't quite match the shuddering grooves nor flatter a vocal delivery that reminds me a little bit too much of Kimbra. Yeah, the imperfection was the point, but there are themes where lurid detail would elevate and intensify, which leads to a pretty good and relevant story, but not quite a new one, nor a great one. 6 out of 10, only if you're curious. Next up, from US Girls, Heavy Light. And speaking of genre pivots, US Girls are one of those experimental acts in which I've heard in passing, especially as mastermind Megan Remy operates out of Toronto, and they've accrued a lot of critical acclaim in the past 5 years, mostly for 2015's murky Half Free and 2018's a lot more refined and accessible In a Poem Unlimited, which takes a grab bag of archetypes and stylistic cues from previous eras of rock and then grafts them around some hard, feminist, and fiercely political subjects. And a lot of it's really damn potent. Half Free I still hold as having Remy's best songs to date, with In a Poem Unlimited probably being the most robust and consistent album, but now on Heavy Light, I get the feeling I should like this a lot more than I do. I like a lot of the textures here, mostly rooted in a late 70s sound with touches of synthwave, disco, soul, post-punk, and even a smattering of yacht rock and no wave, which can push the mono edge of this album a little further than probably intended, but it nails the atmosphere. And on cuts that pick up more momentum, like Overtime, or some pretty striking ballads like IOU or Denise Don't Wait, it gets to the roots of the anxious, exhausted neuroses of the album, a similar time where everything seemed to be spiraling out of control in the late 70s, with protest fires already lit and a keen eye to issues of today like data-driven surveillance and climate change and relationship gaslighting and State House, It's a Man's World, making a pretty horrifying subtextual statement about the retraction of women's rights. It's really on the nose, but it's effective. But not only do some of these songs feel undercooked and lacking the same edge, the sense of urgency is really inconsistent. And if I'm bringing back my 3 Ps for great political art, well, it struggles to hit wide populist appeal given the sound and the relative lack of strong hooks. It's not as precise as it could be, and as a whole, it kind of lacks power, not helped by the diffuse sound collages that might be impressionistic, but don't really come together. And this is gonna be a strange parallel, but it reminds me a lot of modern PJ Harvey albums. Really potent artistic statements with the right targets and the right ideas, but feeling a lot safer than they should. 6 out of 10, I'm a little disappointed. Kind of expected more. Next up from Phantogram, Ceremony. Okay, maybe it's just me, but I gotta say it at this point. Phantogram are now 4 albums in, and they seem to be actually getting worse. And when it's been 4 years between albums, I stopped making excuses. Now granted, I don't think any of their albums have been great per se, but at this point we're a decade in, and there's no strong crossover single to save or redeem this mess, which throws skittering trap elements and programmed percussion against increasingly claustrophobic, squonking synths that are trying to evoke a lot of fractured grandeur, a lot of that this week, and a lot of samples that don't match with anything due to muddy and inconsistent fidelities, and overmixed guitar fragments fighting within the murk for the faint hope of a hook might materialize, that Sarah Barthel's singing might struggle free, and then the desperate prayer that Josh Carter's voice does not. What's frustrating is that in this compressed mono-genre pile-up where the edges are as much of the point was increasingly played out 3 years ago, and here it still can't bother to coalesce around a solid low-end groove. It's the same issue as 3. Phantogram albums have the tonal weight and swell to really explode or surge, but they're missing the foundation and the blended focus to do so. That's before we get to the atonal messes songs across the midsection that might be trying for more apocalyptic atmosphere, but are nowhere near sharp enough to deliver it. Now this is where I would hope the writing would step up as it did on 3, and you know what, let me give the duo too much credit and say that if they're trying to imply an increasingly dystopian world, the ceremonies and social norms, they'll fracture and become fragile, and that can lead to drama and human relationships or extreme behavior. Intriguing idea, but it's a thin concept at best to stretch over a lot of bad production, and the lyrical ideas are really given the thought or innovative wordplay to make them more unique and potent, especially given the specter of Sarah Barthel's sister's death that lingers over a few songs that tonally hit some flat notes. That's where we get the thudding, splatter painting writing of cuts like Gaunt Kids that, again, think playing word association passes for depth. In other words, I'm sorry, even with no expectations, this is a real disappointment. 4 out of 10, not good. Next up from Brandy Clark, Your Life is a Record. Now on the flip side, if we're talking about artists who actually took 4 years to deliver excellence, we got a new album from Brandy Clark, one of the mainstream adjacent country singer-songwriters who has consistently made some fantastic albums. From the landmark 2013 debut 12 Stories, that's still not pressed on vinyl and it really should be, to 2016's Big Day in a Small Town. She tends to get bucketed into the indie country crowd because she's a fantastic writer and has never gotten radio support, but she actually is still on Warner, and like her last album, she's got Jay Joyce on production. Although, unlike the broader, viciously incisive scope of her previous album, she's dialing into more personal drama here after the breakup of a 15-year relationship, along with the sound picking up more strings and brass. It almost kind of reminds me a bit of that last Mike and the Moonpies album from last year, along with some of the spare, rickety acoustics that prove that Jay Joyce can be a subtler producer when he's built some familiarity with the artist, and he actually seems to care. That tells me a lot about what happened with that last Miranda Lambert album. Now, that being said, there is an odd tension on this project between the broader, some of the flashier instrumentals, and Brandy Clark's style of writing and delivery. That's a lot more low-key and clever and pulling in some subtler emotive territory. Where a relationship that long falls apart, there's history and deeply rooted complications where nobody's fully in the right, and folks have changed over years and years. And Brandy Clark is introspective and detailed enough to really dig into that messy territory, especially when the lingering feelings are still complicated. And on the one hand, that can really work for some slightly more stately and mature instrumentals, so long as the groove's a little textured and unstable, or whenever Brandy Clark goes more acoustic or dream country, it's her comfort zone, she does it really well. But then there are moments that feel a little broad or kind of off message, the most jarring being the country soul cut Love Is a Fire, and then a Randy Newman duet Bigger Boat, which might have a great hook, but kind of feels too goofy to match with the rest of the tone. And while there is a part of me that kind of wishes a little bit more anger tempered the theatricality, Girl Next Door proved that Brandy Clark could knock that out of the park. She's still really emotive and subtle enough everywhere else to put together a lot of great songs, and yeah, you know what? This is still a winner. Solid 8 out of 10. If you're a fan of country, absolutely worth your time. Next up from Megan Thee Stallion, SUGA.
Bitches poppin', I do what they copy, ayy. Look, he's a sweetie, kiss it when he eat it, ayy. Yeah, know it's good when you chewin', ayy, singing.
So I've watched the Megan Thee Stallion label drama the past couple of weeks, and I'm not the only one who's had the suspicion it's less public beef than disguised rollout and Rock Nation power play on the side. And while I could wish that I could have said I called this, turned out my suspicions were more tied to 300 than her Houston label 1501 Entertainment, the larger question becomes, why? Because while you can argue that any publicity is good publicity, Megan is a rising star, and this sort of label controversy early on has derailed some very talented artists. I still remember Eve in the early 2000s. Look that up if you want to get really sad. Of course, I've also heard whispers that this was done to garner some positive press ahead of a weaker than expected project to strike while the iron's hot, and yet after listening to SUGA, why do I somehow have the sinking feeling that might be true, at least from the label's point of view? What's frustrating is that not only does SUGA feel rushed, it's got the sound of trying to address some criticisms of Fever, but without full consideration of how to do that well. Yeah, the sound is more diverse, but songs sound incomplete, underproduced, and often sloppily blended, or sometimes just outright missing hooks to end out the song properly. Yes, Megan's trying to show off a little more versatility as a performer, and her rhymes do connect more consistently, but she's also singing, and that's not her strong suit, as she sounds utterly drained of energy and presence, and the auto-tune only makes it worse. It just kills the final third of the album, which makes it all the more alarming when you discover the underwhelming production was served up by Timbaland and the Neptunes. What happened? And while I understand that lyrically Megan's trying to show more diversity in her writing and a little bit more vulnerability in her SUGA persona, hell, it's how she opens up the album, but I gotta be honest, it's pretty bare bones, and it could have afforded to cut a little deeper, show a little bit more introspection. But as a whole, just feels undercooked, folks. I did expect more. 5 out of 10, only for the fans. Next up, from Jhene Aiko, Chilombo.
Free time, you don't need no me time. That's you and me time.
Am I the only one who's a little bit perplexed by how much actual buzz Jhene has received for this new project? I mean, I like to chalk it up to the organic growth of her following and the slow acceptance that sold out as one of the best R&B albums of the 2010s. But there's also a part of me with the sinking feeling that she's becoming more well known for a specific archetype and a now more popular, understated brand of R&B, because, yeah, she absolutely did blaze the way for SZA and Snow Allegra and Summer Walker and so many others, but that also has meant that her own quiet brilliance has not always been highlighted as strongly as it should have, and that's even getting into the artistic and personal kinship she's found with Big Sean of all people. Yes, I'm giving her all the credit for his slow maturity into becoming a better artist, which means when I'm now discussing her newest album, well, I'm just not sure it gives me nearly as much to say as Sold Out and Trip did, both of which were highly conceptual projects, and this isn't quite that. I'm not saying it's bad, or even that it's not great, as Jhene still has buckets of charisma, and when she locks into her dewy, sensuous vibe on the project's back half, I really enjoyed it. Although, I really do wish she had stuck with more organic percussion and more pluckier instrumentals instead of all the overweight trap beats. Those don't flatter her, but it also doesn't quite feel as layered and introspective as her previous albums, even if the arc of the love story might be very true. It started by tearing into this guy, and then the extended, messy arc of healing and reconciliation. Part of it is her frustrating inconsistency of getting the guest stars to work. It's always been an issue, but while Nas's verse on 10,000 Hours will likely make that one of my favorite songs of the year, and she even got quality work out of Future and Miguel together, remaking one of her old songs from 2011, but Big Sean, Ab-Soul, her, and John Legend, they just sound a little out of pocket on their parts. But part of it is also how the album doesn't exactly maintain a lot of momentum on the back half, which is a vibe I love, but can feel a little drawn out like Trip if you can't click in with a more hopeful or optimistic Jhene. But even then, by the end, you can kind of tell she's second-guessing even the right decisions, which is exactly the sort of sober maturity that Jhene always sneaks into the background. So it might not be perfect, but it's beautiful now. In other words, it's an 8 out of 10 for me. Great stuff. And finally, from Lil Uzi Vert, Eternal Atake.
I stay with the baddest, I'm counting cabbage while making my lady come.
This album actually got added to my schedule last time it was open. In 2018. Same patron who did it too, so thanks for your patience. But it got me thinking about Lil Uzi Vert's baffling and consistent popularity, so I went back and re-listened to the entire bloated mess that is Love Is Rage 2, and I think I get the appeal. I mean, at his best, the comparison that came to mind the most was Playboy Carti. Utterly empty, sugary trap bangers with way more style than substance. It was basically a crapshoot if the song clicked due to his utter inability to maintain a consistent tone in delivery or content. That's arguably the reason why EXO Tour Life has never really worked for me, because while it is a pitch-black moment of existential horror in the party in the same vein that Just Dance by Lady Gaga is, it never fully nails that balance and tone. It's also a formula that's not built to last, so when Eternal Atake fell into development hell, I never expected it to get released, especially when the singles just kept flopping. But here we are, and you know, I'd probably sound a lot more impressed if Uzi's content or sound had really evolved significantly beyond piling on the spacey synths and the thinnest possible alien abduction framing device against your standard, although bizarrely underweight trap percussion. But those are really token changes for a project that in the streaming economy, other artists would churn out within 6 months. And when you open up your album with a cut that might as well be a Future ripoff, and then spend your album delivering Lil Wayne riffs with less wordplay and more brand names, I'm just left consistently underwhelmed. That's before the album proper ends with P2, a flagrant attempt to remix the success of EXO Tour Life and highlight just how empty of new ideas this album really is. And since this album doesn't have much variation in concept or really the sound, all the excess and flash just gets really one-dimensional really fast. And that doesn't have to be a bad thing. Look at Lil Jon or Andrew WK. It's both shallow music, it's one-dimensional, original, but the common lesson that none of these acts learned is that you need brevity to provide some focus, ergo this should have been a half hour at most, and it's not like Lil Uzi Vert is a great rapper to even be the best at this one thing. He slides out the beat, his flows are unoriginal, his vocal inflections are really flat and overexposed in the mix. He's not really a likable presence given his attitudes towards everyone, especially women, not even touching the lines about turning gay girls straight on a song right after Sid guest starred. And as there is so many embarrassing lines, alright, look, he really is the definition of someone who has kept a lot of cultural longevity, more on scarcity of his product and image rather than the actual content. And maybe I'm just not enough of a hype beast to get on board, but yeah, sorry. I ain't impressed by this. 4 out of 10 for the fans, and I know there's a lot of them. Not for me. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Hope you guys all really enjoyed this. I know there's currently some panic going on with the coronavirus and a lot of the quarantines that are spreading across the United States. Please stay safe. Please stay careful. I really do appreciate all your support, but if you guys feel a need to pull support from Patreon at any time, I completely understand. I'll be fine. Everyone else probably needs it more than I do. I'll be okay. But beyond that, if you do want to support me, link to my Patreon's right over there. We get to impact my schedule. Happy to have you guys hop on board with that. It's still something special. Beyond that, have any comments about all the albums I covered? Comments down there below. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.